Okay, welcome to another Tuesday night at the Mechanics Institute, and we're now here ready for the Tuesday night marathon. It'll be round 3, isn't it, coming up now? Round 3. And tonight we will review some of our Tuesday night marathon games, but the news in the chess world at large is the women's candidates. And we have this fantastic young player there, Alexandra Gorachino, and she's just running away with the tournament after 9 rounds. She's got 7.5 points. Katerina Lano, so the new challenger for the women's. Then sort of a shake-up of how things have been for a while. And we've had these great Chinese players, such as Hoya Fan, who's been to the club here. Great new young Russian talent might take the title back for Russia. Meanwhile, there is the Altibox Norway tournament going on in Norway. And surprise, surprise, Magnus Carlsen is leading once again. They have a very unusual format in this tournament. The players play a round of the classical chess. And if the game turns out to be a draw, then they have to play one quick Armageddon game where white gets 10 minutes, black gets 7 minutes. But if the game is a draw, black has won the Armageddon phase of it. And so in that case, they would have drawn their regular standard time control game, but the winner of the Armageddon gets 1.5 points for that, as opposed to 0.5 point for the loser. If you win the classical game, you get 2 points for the tournament, and you don't have to play the Armageddon, of course. So in that tournament, Carlsen is he's in the lead. He's got, after 6 rounds, 9.5 out of the possible 12 points. And Yu Yangzi's in second with 8 points. Aronian, 7.5. Our own Wesley So with 6.5. Caruana only has 5 points. He's there in, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th place. Not in bad company. Vachier, Legrave, and Grishuk are below, so they've got an all-star field there in the Norwegian chess. So why don't we, it's not so important the order, why don't we take one of our games from the Tuesday night marathon. We have a lot of action there, but this one I quite enjoyed, Daniel McKellar against Nick Cazares, because it started out a Queen's Gambit and a Slav defense. Both players are playing good opening theory. D7. So Daniel takes on D5, and Nick takes back with the E pawn. So you get your classical exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit here. White develops. Both sides castle. Rook E8's a very useful place for the rook. Queen to C2. So most standard is the knight back to F8 to develop the bishop and guard this H7 pawn in case the knight gets removed. But Nick attacked the bishop. And here was a good move. Knight H5 kind of forces the exchange of this bishop for either the bishop or the knight, and that sort of relieves some pressure on the black's position. So bishop takes e7, rook takes e7, very classical. And Daniel plays this classic minority attack, pawn to b4 to try to break up this very solid queenside pawn formation. And standard, probably best, is pawn to a6, just slows down the white advance over there. Nick got a little nervous here and decided he had to react with pawn to b5, stopping the advance. And that's kind of a mistake. Pawn to a4 gets white a serious initiative over on the queen side. So this part gone a little wrong for black. Maybe you should take it, but things are opening up. He played knight b6, which loses a pawn. And so, okay, we have sometimes some mistakes in our tournament. We're not all Magnus Carlsen, but this game gets very interesting for what happens afterwards. Suppose he should really just retreat, say, okay, maybe this pawn's a little loose, but you're up a pawn. It's good for white. But that's what happens, that you decide you have an advantage and you really want to go for it, kind of knock them out with a good punch. And Daniel came knight to e5, really figuring this knight to c6 was going to squash black. So this comes at a good move. Nick takes the knight on e5, sacrificing the exchange. And what I like about this game is there's so much action in it. It's just sort of non-stop. Pawn takes on e5, pawn takes the knight on b5. So right now it's two knights against a rook and a pawn, sort of material equality. But rook takes a8, knight takes a8, and you could get a second pawn with bishop takes b5, but he decides, well, first, what's happening to this knight out here? It's got no place to retreat to, but, well, you defend it. The knight can go back, but Daniel takes it on h5, pawn takes. All those pawns are kind of shattered there. And then queen to c6, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn. h6 pawn 2. Really looks nice for white. It must feel good to be able to go in there, attack everything like that. But what you see is this nice, cool defense. It develops the bishop, just holding the center, holding that pawn. You couldn't hold everything. Queen takes the pawn on b5, but now the knight at least comes to b6, and it's got a good square over there. Now, I'm sure Daniel felt, well, it's still everything loose over here, and you've got this nice passed b pawn. You're technically up material, a rook and two pawns against these two minor pieces. And he plays, oh, I'm sorry, he did rook to c1 before queen takes b5. It's my mistake, but it transposes queen c6, bishop e6. Yeah, he had done rook to c1 first, then knight b6, then queen takes, and then knight to c4, and actually, which you can't defend this e-pawn. You could go pawn to f4, but the knight would take on e3. So he goes back to the d file. The knight takes the pawn on e5.
What's wrong with queen g5 now? Instead of taking the pawn? For black?
It's possible.
Okay.
It's possible. Yeah, I'd rather dwell on what comes later. But taking the pawn is very good because you also want the knight here. The knight does, we'll see, does a lot there. And it's this position where Daniel played pawn to e4, where he has two cross pins. Now the pawn can't take because of queen takes e5, but also the rook's here. You can't push the pawn because the queen takes the knight. You know, this pass pawn, all this activity, it just looks so great for the white side. But that's what's so nice about chess. There's sort of the static elements, and there's the dynamic ones, the things that are in flux. So just when it looks like you're really under big pressure, losing a second pawn, your king's open against a king with perfect pawn structure. Nick then plays queen to g5, and suddenly the game just takes on a completely different feel. It's now black with the queen and the two minor pieces that is getting all the play over on the king side. And it just happens so fast. Now, one move, and suddenly all kinds of threats. For instance, if the pawn would take on d5, well, we could go let's see, we have to see if we could go bishop to h3 immediately. Would queen f1 hold on there? We have check and attack. Queen to f4. Who suggested that? Well done, well done. What a move. You know, this checkmate or the queen there. The black pieces swarm over the king side. You can actually try to stop, and probably we don't take the queen, but keep the attack going, and you control all these squares over here. Yeah, if you can. Or could we have even done worse with queen e4? Not sure he could take the bishop. I think this is quite good. And nothing's completely forced, but the black pieces take on this whole new life over here. So white has to be extremely careful all of a sudden. Excuse me, that's a black pawn on d5. So Daniel, maybe he got nervous and decided, well, all these things happening here, and he's the one who's had the initiative all the time, so he checks, he presses the king, and then the queen should probably have stayed on the defense. And funny, the black king is very safe here, despite those split pawns. Now bishop h3 is a real threat, so Daniel plays king f1. And now Nick just takes the pawn on e4, guarding the knight, and this pawn is a help in the attack also. So black clearly has the advantage. queen to d6. Bishop checks. Well, you don't want to go king to e1. King back to g1. And the bishop now gets back to this diagonal around the king. So maybe rook a1 might be a little better. He puts the rook behind the passed pawn, but clearly you need to do something quickly for the white side. Mate is threatened, so pawn to g3, and queen f5 just threatens queen h3, ending it all. So now at least a good defense. You've gotten yourself in trouble for white. But now he plays queen a6. It's the only way back to the defending square. So queen to h3 would be just met by queen to f1, and you haven't gained anything there. Nick instead cuts that off with knight to d3, so the queen can't get back to the king side. But he plays queen a7, so you can't run away with the queen while the f-pawn's undefended there. Nick defends it with the king. And he checks. King back. Now we are on the 36 move, so both players are running short of time. Check. Pawn to f6 to block and not repeat. Queen to a7 check. King to g6. And looks good. Looks like you're going to get in your queen to h3 move. But he comes in back looking to get a deadly queen to g8 check.
That's a mate check, right?
Well, right now it would be mate, yes. Yes. Well, queen to h3 would avoid the mate, but unfortunately, check, and queen c8, it would lose the queen over here. So even when you've got such a tremendous attack, one little slip, and that would go. And now here, I guess, a matter of time and nerves it was, Nick decided, well, he'll go back, stopping that. Queen a7 check, back, queen to b8, and you agree to draw.
He offered to draw.
He offered to draw. Well, that was, I have to say, that was clever of him. But as we look just a little closer, one just slow move, queen to e6. You just cover yourself here, and the rook's not helping out. It's a solitary queen that's attacking you, but these black pieces are tremendous, and there's one completely deadly threat here, which, in fact, you can't stop. Just simply pawn to e3, when you'd have 4 pieces attacking. Pawn, you can't allow pawn takes, and if takes, it's going to be a check, and this is just mate by checks. So really the only way for Daniel to stop that pawn to e3 is I put, the rook can't go to e1, it gets taken, you'd have to go back queen to a7, and unfortunately that takes away your threat of the counterplay, so queen h3 would just be the mate. And so I loved all the action in this game, all the looking good for the white side, and suddenly you charge out and the game completely changes. And well, maybe a draw is not quite fair, but still a great comeback. At this point, we've seen one of your games. We'll see one of Magnus's games. He's just winning all the time now, so certainly doesn't get boring for his Norwegian fans. But none of the tournaments he's played in the last 4 months have been anywhere near close. He's just head and shoulders ahead of all the field. I think he likes this new format that if it's a draw, you have to play some quicker time control, because he's just dominant at the quick time controls as well as the slow ones. But the game I'm showing you is from the slow time control. And it was against Alexander Grishuk, who was second in the recent Grand Prix tournament.
What happened to him? He's in last place now. The Grisha, the exhausted?
Yes, he's having a bad event.
Oh, okay.
He's well, I saw one game in the Armageddon where if you draw as black, you win the Armageddon stage. And Grishuk had black, and he was a pawn up. And you get an increment, so you can, he had a rook and 3 pawns against a rook and 2 pawns, impossible to lose. But then suddenly he knocked over all the pieces and lost on time. That was tragic.
The bishop on e6 was also tragic. See that?
So,
In a later game, he had to put his bishop on h6, and his opponent had a fianchetto, so there was a black bishop on g7. And I think his queen was on c1 protecting the bishop.
mm-hmm.
And to interfere with his own defense, he put a knight in between his queen and the
Just allowing.
bishop. And I think Fabiano just got the bishop on h6. It was terrible. No time reversion, no nothing.
So he's just in terrible form. Sometimes that happens to all of us. But this next opponent, he's black against Magnus. You don't have to be in terrible form at all for that. And Magnus plays d4. And Grishuk plays the Grunfeld defense. The King's Indian isn't quite as respectable as it used to be. Nowadays, people, especially the supercomputers, they take a space advantage and they simply say that white's better. But the Grunfeld is it opens the game. White gets some space, but black has made a break in the center, and he gets to exchange off at least one set of minor pieces, so he's not as cramped. They follow classical theory of the exchange variation. Pawn to c5. Rook c1, queen a5, queen d2. So, Grishuk could go into an ending, but white still has some space. A lot of people don't like it so much for black. He's a little cramped. So Grishuk keeps his options with the c-pawn. Castles, Magnus develops, and bishop to g4 which indirectly puts more pressure on the d4 pawn. And Magnus chooses an interesting choice. He just advances, so maybe the pawns will get screwed up a little bit, but he's got more of those pawns in the center. And instead of d4 being the target, c3 is the target. So Grishuk uses his queenside pawns. It's kind of reasonable. He could have traded, but knight d7, castles. This is all pretty reasonable for both sides. Now Grishuk exchanges on f3, so his knight and bishop have more control over the e5 square. Magnus takes back with the bishop. Kind of looks like there's play for both sides here. Pawn to c4. And very interesting play from Magnus. He plays this very slowly. Well, I guess maybe the knight can hop in, but he simply retreats with the bishop. And okay, maybe he can move his pawns, maybe he'll exchange bishops. But here comes already a critical stage of the game. Okay, people could debate this opening. Is white really better, or black's got enough counterplay? Is the knight much inferior to the bishop? But Grishuk plays what looks like a very natural-looking move. Looks like there's action over here on the queen side, and he moves his rook to d8, where it looks like it should be. One thing annotators do, or they used to do in the old days, somebody would move a rook somewhere, and they'd want to put some comment, so they always said, the wrong rook. It's often hard to prove which rook belonged somewhere. You find out 5, 10 moves later or something. But here, it turns out very quickly that that's the wrong rook. It's looking for black to get play on this side, but there's the other side of the board. And Magnus immediately takes advantage of that. He goes pawn to f4, and he's headed to the king side. Grishuk brings his knight over to this side. Magnus simply keeps control of the center. 4 breaks there. Now Grishuk may feel his queen's a little out of play, and he comes to a3. He's able to get back. This next move of Magnus, I mean, I certainly wouldn't play in a fast game. Don't know, I'd probably have to have a lot of time in a slow game. But you want to attack for the white side. But this looks like a coffee house move, except that it's just so good. He plays pawn to h4. There were some players that would always move their h-pawn no matter what. They just throw it up the board, kind of confuses things, see what happened. But this turns out to be a really good move. It's funny, this looks like such a solid king side, but we'll see in just a very few moves that it's not. And you can see actually the white pieces, rook, 2 bishops, queen, and these pawns. You're starting to feel a heavy force headed that way. While this queen is over, the knight's over. So Grishuk moves in the center, and Magnus just advances. Okay, Grishuk could take. I think Magnus would probably take back. Wouldn't really matter. Instead, Grishuk brings the knight over so that there's 3 attacking the c-pawn. Magnus doesn't care for the moment. He just continues on the king side. And still, he's not so concerned. Now pawn to f5. And there's a lot happening over here. Okay, Grishuk could take this pawn. Well, the knight takes doesn't really, doesn't affect so much. I think that might be bad. You could probably take, maybe bishop to g4, and you're going to take that with check. You could also take with the bishop on c3, which that's your last defender on the king sides.
Yeah, knight on a4.
Ah, excuse me. Thank you. And here you could just run over. You might decide you want to take that bishop as I mean, there's nothing left defending the king side there. So Grishuk decides not to be greedy. He exchanges pawns and brings the queen back for the defense. And when you do something like that, where you piled up on some pawn and then suddenly decide, okay, I just don't have the time to take it, well, you know you're in trouble when you're then running back for the defense. But still, it's the best thing to do. I mean, if you're going to lose by the straightforward course of action, you choose any of the alternatives. And against a lot of people, that would work. Magnus attacks the queen, bishop f4, check on b6, runs out of the way, and Grishuk takes the pawn on f5 before the white pawn further reduces the white kingside protection, or sorry, the black kingside protection. And the next part is a real lesson in attack. First, Magnus advances the d pawn. Okay, you're threatening the exchange, but this pawn also, it cuts the black forces in two. You can't get through it without a sacrifice. And furthermore, the white bishop, if it doesn't take the rook, will have further scope. Grishuk, well, he saves his rook. And the bishop comes to d5. You can't do an exchange sacrifice because you take it, and then bishop takes f7 after the queen takes. So he brings the knight back for a defense. And then just a little move from Magnus, just backs up with the bishop so his rook can get into play. Now, knight e4 looks like it might be a good kind of defense, forking these. Magnus would then have probably played exchange and then sacrificing the rook here, which, okay, if you don't take it, see you're going to more slowly lose, even though rook b7 might be better. But when there's nothing guarding the king, it's just easy to get in. And here there's no square for the king to go to. If you go to the F file, there's a rook check. If you go king e8, queen e6 followed by the rook check. If you go king g6, and back to the F file is a rook check. Any other square is the queen and bishop are going to checkmate you. You mean check here? You want to go there? I mean check, probably this check. I'm not sure which square you go to. There's, again, all the black pieces are on this side of the board. So it's strange how they just can't get back to defend. And it all started with pawn to h4, just so it gets to h5, takes one defender, the f pawn takes another defender, and then that leaves you open to a sacrifice of the last defense. Grishuk didn't go down this way. He sort of tried, if I may say, a slightly more cowardly defense. He simply went back with the knight to e6, but then rook takes f5, to stop the white pieces from coming in. Yeah, he's just going to double. It's all over. So he sacrificed the exchange. Okay, hoping that would stem the white attack. Magnus just gets out of the pin, tries to trade the queen, which Magnus doesn't want an endgame. Although all the white pieces pile up very naturally. Grishuk defended the f pawn, but that's not the end of his troubles. He did queen to c7, and well, Magnus just threatened checkmate, of which there was no good defense. So now, well, Grishuk had to throw in the towel. I guess something like rook e8 is the only way to avoid mate in 1 or 2. So again, just very powerful chess from Magnus. I don't know when I'm going to stop showing you these Magnus games. He just keeps winning the tournaments by a few points, but I guess eventually he'll take a vacation or something. So with our time left, I think I'll show you another Tuesday night marathon game, if you don't mind. Could show you one of the Wunderkind, the women's candidates winner, or almost winner. But there's more action in the games that happen here. So we'll take Christian Clemens against Bruce Rickard. And this, once again, Christian is white, Bruce is black. Quickly transposes into a Slav defense. Knight f6, c4, and c6. By a different move order, we get a classic position. 3. Bishop D3. Black exchanges on C4 and hits with B5. D3 on E6. Castles and pawn to C5. So both sides develop. Rook D1. And maybe this is a little quick to exchange on D4. It gives white the isolated D pawn, but now the bishop on C1 can get out. Bishop E7 and bishop to G5. Castles with, a very classic Queen's Gambit sort of position of the isolated pawn. Okay, white's hoping to attack with the development and slightly more space in the center. Black holding the D5 square, wanting to get a better endgame. Well, Christian advances. Okay, so knight takes, the pawn on E5 is crimping on the king side. And you have to be very careful in these positions already. Bruce plays knight B6, which covers the D5 square, but a little away from the king side. Bishop C2 and pawn to H6, and that move always worries me in these positions. It's the big problem is this B1 to H7 diagonal that white usually tries to get play on that, and once you move the H pawn, it's harder to defend with pawn to G6. So Christian, well, he immediately takes on F6 with the bishop. Oh, excuse me. That didn't happen, and a little surprised as to why. He first went back bishop H4, and then after pawn to B4, he then takes on F6 with the bishop. So actually, sort of clever to wait. I guess he wanted to loosen the queen side a little bit. Bruce takes, and he heads in with knight to E4. However, Elliot was looking at this game and was wondering, well, what happens if you threaten checkmate immediately? And so you don't want to try to run away and let the queen down to H7. White can move the knight afterwards. That's just clearly a good attack for white for nothing. You could play your pawn to G6 move, and then the question is, can white get away with the sacrifice on G6? You've got this knight already hanging, but you simply press the attack anyway. Knight takes G6 because you've got a threat to move the knight check and queen down checkmate. He would have to take the knight. The queen takes the pawn check, and probably you can believe that white gets an attack worth more than the piece here. He's already got 2 pawns for it. But that would be really a very risky pressing move to be trying to sacrifice here while your knight's in take. And Christian decided, okay, let's just move, it looks so natural, move the knight to the center, close to the king's side. You mean it's logical to take? Sorry, he could have done which move before?
Play bishop takes f6 after kick me with h6 instead of going back to bishop a4. I should probably just take him with f6.
Yes.
I also just didn't see it. You weren't here. You said you should have done it right away. Yeah, I just didn't see it.
Yeah, that would have been more accurate, but this.
He was being kicked, so then it was like forced. But now he gets knight up.
Yeah, after you were kicked here, you had the question, do I take? And there it was a more serious question. And you found the right solution. That was very nice after pawn to b4 that you did bishop f6. And it's really about as good as before.
I still couldn't see the win after rook e8 instead of if I had played queen to d3 instead of knight to e4. I thought he would play rook e8 and I couldn't find. I didn't think queen h7 would actually lead to anything.
Well, it's some advantage. The queen down there and even just moving the, yeah. No, I'm okay. There's probably not a knockout blow. I didn't see one either, but it has to be good to have the queen there and pieces around. And here you have an advantage. This is an advantage, but he plays. He's worried about this knight. I mean, it's certainly a nice centralized knight, but he takes it, and that he just really shouldn't do. I mean, positionally, it's kind of fine that you take it and you have the d5 square and such, but what do you do about the attack? You have to go pawn to g6, and maybe that was his point. He thought, oh well, that's a fine defense. But this is why the game is so fun, because you now just, boom, take it on g6, and takes, check. Okay, bishop has to go back to g7, and so that's 2 pawns for the piece, and I guess you can get a third. It's oh, excuse me, that's what you did do. Yes, probably this one was the best. Check, check, and the queen's stuck there. You know that. Yes, that's threatening rook h8.
Yeah, the line that I saw was I didn't see it during the game with rook d3.
Yes, you know, here threatening to win your queen, but that king is the more exposed, and that's going to be the end of it. Yeah, I mean, well, rook h8, yeah, loses the bishop along with the king, but yeah, the computer couldn't see a good defense for this, but it does look very funny here. The queen stuck down there. Your move looks perfectly natural, and of course it's got to be good to take the pawn check. You now have 3 pawns for the piece. Of course, if he comes back, you could always go queen here, and and sorry, in fact, he did go back. He needs to play that, because the other way just doesn't work, even though he's going to lose he's going to lose the exchange too. So you'll be up material.
On the first check, could you go to h8 right away and not put the bishop in between? Is that right?
In fact, we will go right back to that. He had to play this and defend that way, and it's still bad for black. But yeah, Bruce, in fact, did go back there. One thing, though, you've still got the diagonal. And so you could go queen g6 or, as Christian did, queen e4.
But could it have happened on the first, when he took on g6, was checked the first instance, the bishop went on f6? Right.
Yes, no, he had to, there was a pawn on e6. So yeah, he had to, only way to avoid mate in one. And, well, check, king h8, queen e4, king g8, check, king f7, almost like the previous variation without the pawn on e6. And now a nice move, getting the rook into the attack. And Richard brings his queen out, defending the bishop, so you can check with the rook, and the king can go running and hope to survive. Maybe it would. But so often in these attacks, you just slow down a second, look at the position, say, oh, wait a minute, I can stop his entire defense. Very good. Rook e1, just bring that last piece into play. No check or anything. But then Bruce looked at the position, said, oh my God, what am I going to do on rook to f3 check? And there's simply no move at all. So he resigned. Well, thanks, Christian. That was a fun attacking game. We have a bit more time, and so I think I will show you at least the beginning of this game, where our young heroine, Alexandra Gorachina, she had the black side against Valerie Gunanina.
Is she an unknown? I mean, how old is she?
17 years old, I believe. Wow. So just coming up in the world, and clearly a tremendous force. And she's got 7.5 points out of 9. Just an incredible performance, 2.5 points ahead of the field.
But there's still like 5 rounds, yeah?
Yeah, there's a few rounds to go. Theoretically, she could be caught, but it's almost impossible. And the interesting thing, I'm curious to see her in the next couple of years, too, if she's anywhere near like what the performance she's shown, then, well, she'd have a very good match with Hoya Fan or whoever else. And maybe even play in some of the men's tournaments the way that Judith Polgar used to do. Missing one somewhere. Oh. Okay. So, Valentina Gunanina with white, and Alexandra with black, and she plays the Caro-Kann defense. So, Gunina decides to do something a little odd. This two knights variation of the Caro-Kann, which a lot of people just don't like to play against the regular stodgy Caro-Kann, so they kind of mix it up a bit. It doesn't get white any theoretical advantage, but it can be a little different. Alexandra takes on e4, knight to f6. Variation Larson used to play, allowing the doubled pawns. But Gunina just defends the knight.
Do you really have to play d4?
Pardon?
Or to change the change? What's wrong with playing d4?
D4 by black. Yes, that's, in fact, there's some Fischer-Petrosian game in that, pawn to d4, and that's a theoretically good line, or very acceptable line for black, too. So, yeah, it's simply a matter of choice what black wants.
And now black can't play knight e7.
Thank you. She was hoping for that move. Okay. You don't get to be winner of the women's candidates with moves like that. I think I'll just show the first part of this because it's very indicative of her play. There was queen a5, bishop c4. Now the queen guards the bishop coming to f5, a nice aggressive square. Shouldn't take it, which might get trapped or behind in development. She just gets her pieces out. Aggressive play from Gunina, but as long as black develops, can't get into trouble. Pawn to c3, finally guarding that. Bishop to f6, pawn to d4. Looks like a reasonable position for the white side. Got your pawns out, develop maybe a little more control of the center. Except just give up that bishop and attack the e5 pawn. And very solid for black. So here Gunina goes, gets a little ambitious, or too ambitious. She takes space, advancing on the king side, bishop g6, and pawn to f4. So nice aggressive play. You think of a lot of players and you admire that they come after the black position that way. But young Alexandra, she does something nice. She hits the bishop on b5. So the knight can hit something when it comes to the c5 square. The computer had this position about even or something, and Gunina now says, well, all right, I see your knight's going to come to c5 and such. So she hits the queen there, taking the c5 square away from the black knight. And again, white is hoping to have an advantage in space, the two bishops and such. But young Alexander comes up with a great move here. Anyone with a guess? We have like a couple minutes. Well, I think we better go.
Bishop b3.
It's the pawn's attacking the queen. Yeah. What she does, she goes all the way back. It's this switchback that you just don't expect. Suddenly, you know, the queen's on the queen side. You're worried all about the queen side, and yet queen all the way back. The bishop has to move, which it came here, and all of a sudden, it's the other side of the board. And now black has a big advantage. I mean, you can interpose the queen and lose that pawn, or you did what Gunina did, which was actually worse.
I mean, I wouldn't want to lose that pawn, and so I mean, she moved the king, and then black started getting a big attack over here, and so she played this very well and carefully wrapped up the point, even though the defense was pretty good from the white side. But I think I'd have left you go for another round now. Good luck.